Mad Bomber of New York. On December 2nd, 1956, a bomb exploded at the Paramount Movie Theater in Brooklyn, injuring 6 moviegoers. It was the work of the Mad Bomber, an insane terrorist who had been planting bombs throughout New York since November 1940. This individual, who referred to himself as FP in letter mailed to the police, had waged a campaign of hate against the Edison Company and would plant more than 30 bombs, 23 of which would explode, injuring upwards of 15 innocent people. New York detectives were unable to catch the Mad Bomber and sought the assistance of a criminal profiler to help them understand the maniac who had waged war against the electricity giant. That profile would be instrumental in the capture of George Metesky, a mild-mannered and polite man who harbored a personal grudge against his former employers, and who was declared unfit for trial, spending many years in an asylum for the criminally insane. The Mad Bomber of New York, the moniker given to suspect by the New York press, would send no less than 33 bombs across a crime career that would span 16 years. Most of the devices were left in public places, but one was mailed directly to Con Edison. His skillful confidence made tracing the devices almost impossible, and years of traditional police investigative work had led to few clues that might uncover his identity. When targeting movie theaters, he would slash open the underside of a seat covering and insert the bomb before slipping out of the cinema. Some 15 innocent bystanders were wounded by the 24 bombs that exploded. As the years went by, the bombs became more powerful, and with every explosion, the Mad Bomber's incessant, arrogant letters to the police department and local media were making the most sophisticated police force in the world look incompetent. It would take unorthodox methods to catch an unorthodox criminal. The disturbed odyssey of the Mad Bomber of New York began on November 16, 1940, when a bomb planted at the Consolidated Edison Power Plant building, located on West 64th Street in Manhattan, failed to explode. The perpetrator had enclosed the device in a wooden toolbox and placed on a windowsill before slipping out of the building unnoticed. At that time of day, the offices had been bustling, and nobody took any notice of the stranger. Luckily, the small pipe bomb proved to be a dud. Around the device, the bomber had wrapped a note written in neat block lettering, which read, "Con Edison Crooks, this is for you," and "There is no shortage of powder, boys." It was signed FP. The workers who discovered it had called in the bomb squad, and officers found no fingerprints or any other evidence they could use to trace who had made the crude device. The short length of brass pipe had been made filled with gunpowder, with an ignition mechanism made of sugar and flashlight batteries. Investigators were puzzled by the note, mainly because if the device had exploded, it would surely have been destroyed. They wondered if the note was meant to be found, if the author had realized it would be destroyed, or if the bomb was an intentional dud. After some rudimentary checking of the records into any recently dismissed employees, or anyone else who might hold a grievance against the company, police decided to give up on finding the bomber. Although the utility giant Con Edison, as it is locally known, was and continues to remain the primary supplier of energy for the city of New York, there were more pressing cases that had more of a chance of being solved. The incident was not reported in the local press, and no one at Con Edison or the bomb squad had given much thought about the dud pipe bomb in the next few months, and soon enough it was forgotten. In September 1941, almost a year after the first incident, someone found a second unexploded device lying on 19th Street, a few blocks from Con Edison's offices at 4 Irving Place. It consisted of a simple alarm clock detonator which had not been wound properly. Bomb squad investigators recognized the device as similar to the previous construction, only this time the bomber had wrapped his handiwork in an old woolen sock. They theorized the bomber had been on his way to the Con Edison offices nearby, and for whatever reason had aborted his attempt to plant the bomb. Police suspected that he may have spotted someone watching, or even a police patrol car, and simply threw the device into the street without setting the fuse. This time, there was no accompanying note. Once again, the press ignored the incident, which was mainly due to the fact that Europe, as well as the United States' inevitable involvement in World War II, dominated almost every page. Image of a tall building with a clock tower surrounded by other buildings in a cityscape. The sky is overcast. Consolidated Edison Building, located at 4 Irving Place, New York. 3 months later, Just after the U.S. entered the war, the bomber sent a letter to Manhattan Police Headquarters. Written in familiar block capital letters, FP explained that no further bombs would be planted during the war because of patriotic reasons. I will make no more bomb units for the duration of the war. My patriotic feelings have made me decide this. Later I will bring the Con Edison to justice. They will pay for their dastardly deeds. FP. Some of the note had been handwritten, and the handwriting was the same as had been scrawled on the first bomb's note, in neat, legible, and precise lettering. Only the W's were written with a strange, reckless curvature that was oddly out of place with the straight letters. FP was true to his word, and during the next 9 years no bombs were planted. He did, however, write dozens of bizarre, threatening letters to Con Edison, the police, newspapers, movie theaters, and private individuals. On March 29, 1951, a new waves of bombings began. The third bomb planted, but the first to explode, startled commuters in Grand Central Station. It had been dropped into a sand dune near the Grand Central Oyster Bar and Restaurant on the terminal's lower level. Luckily, no one was injured, and the bomb squad recognized the device as similar to the Con Edison bombs. The construction was similar but not identical. It appeared the bomber had used the 9-year hiatus to refine his skills, and the new device was more powerful and skillfully constructed than the first two. Investigators suspected the bomber had possibly served in the military, but they wondered if he had intended the device to explode at all. This theory was dashed when a fourth bomb exploded at the phone booth inside the New York Public Library. In August 1951, a fifth bomb exploded without injury at Grand Central. This incident was dismissed by police as the work of boys or pranksters. However, this bomb was the first to be mentioned by the press, with the New York Times reporting on the event in the following day's issue. However, it would only be a 3-paragraph brief at the bottom of page 24. The next month, another bomb exploded in a phone booth at the Consolidated Edison headquarters building at 4 Irving Place. No one had been injured in that incident, and a 7th bomb which did not explode was mailed to Con Edison from White Plains, New York. Although these incidents were attributed to the same bomber, the New York police did encounter a number of Flace bomb reports, which wasted police resources and frightened the already nervous citizenry. In 1951, a simulated pipe bomb filled with sugar was sent to the Con Edison Company's personnel director at 4 Irving Place. The perpetrator was identified as 56-year-old Frederick Eberhardt, a former Con Edison employee who held a grudge against the company. Eberhardt was exactly the type of disgruntled ex-employee who they believed might be the mad bomber. With more bombs planted after his arrest, it was determined Eberhardt had no involvement in the crimes. He was charged with sending threatening material through the mails. At this arraignment in November 1951, the assistant district attorney told the judge, "This defendant is a particular source of annoyance to the New York City police. We are firmly convinced that he is not of sound mind. He has been sending simulated bombs around the city the past few months." Eberhardt was sent to Bellevue Hospital for psychiatric examination. However, several months later, the case against him was dismissed after his lawyer successfully argued that the package contained no written threats, as the law required. Further false incidents were reported. In October 1951, the main waiting room at the Grand Central Terminal, which was a favorite target of the mad bomber, was evacuated after a telephoned bomb warning. More than 3,000 lockers were searched by some 35 NYPD personnel, taking roughly 3 hours because half of the lockers were in use, and only one master key was available. A searched locker was opened. The head of the bomb squad checked the contents with his hand while keeping a fluoroscopic X-ray device to hand. On October 22nd, the bomber sent a letter to the New York Herald Tribune. It was penciled in the same block capital lettering. "Bombs will continue until the Consolidated Edison Company is brought to justice for their dastardly acts against me. I have exhausted all other means. I intend with bombs to cause others to cry out for justice for me." The letter also directed police to the Paramount Theater in Times Square, which was discovered and disabled, and another within a telephone booth at Pennsylvania Station, but nothing there was found. At the IRT 14th Street subway station, a bomb detonated without injury on November 28th. In December 1951, A letter was received at the Herald Tribune, warning of further attacks. Have you noticed the bombs in your city? If you are worried, I am sorry, and also if anyone is injured. But it cannot be helped, for justice will be served. I am not well, and for this I will make the Con Edison. Sorry, yes, they will regret their dastardly deeds. I will bring them before the bar of justice. Public opinion will condemn them. For beware, I will place more units under theater seats in the near future, FP. In 1952, beginning on March 19th, a bomb exploded in a phone booth at the Port Authority bus terminal. No one was injured. In June and later in December 1952, bombs exploded in the seats at Loew's Theater on Lexington Avenue. One person was injured during the December explosion and would be the first device to cause injury. In an effort to deny the bomber the publicity he sought, police requested the media not print any of the bomber's letters and to play down the earlier bombings. But the people of New York were becoming aware that a mad bomber was carrying out a terror campaign. By 1953, the bomber planted devices at the Radio City Music Hall and the Capitol Theater, which exploded with no injuries. Another bomb targeted the Oyster Bar in the Grand Central Terminal, this time exploding inside a coin-operated rental locker, again with no injuries. In what would the bomber's 16th device, an unexploded bomb was found at Pennsylvania Station. Police described the perpetrator as a publicity-seeking jerk. Damage to the coin-operated locker at the Oyster Bar in the Grand Central Terminal. More bombs followed in 1954, with one found in March, wedged behind a sink in a Grand Central Terminal men's room, which exploded, slightly injuring 3 men. Another was found planted in a phone booth at the Port Authority bus terminal, which exploded with no injuries. At Pennsylvania Station, a phone booth removed for repair was found to contain an unexploded bomb. On November 7, 1954, an audience of 6,200 was watching Bing Crosby's White Christmas at the Radio City Music Hall when a bomb exploded in a seat in the 15th row, injuring 4 patrons. It had been stuffed into the bottom of the cushion, and the explosion had been muffled by the heavy upholstery, so only those close by heard it. As the film continued, the injured were escorted to the building's first aid room, and around 50 people close to the damaged area were taken to the back of the theater. After the film and subsequent stage show ended, an hour and a half later, police moved in to cordon off the area of the explosion and searched for evidence. The mad bomber stepped up his crime spree during 1955, with some 8 bombs planted throughout New York. One exploded without injuries on the platform at the IRT Sutter Avenue subway station in Brooklyn, while another was hung beneath a phone booth shelf on the main floor of Macy's department store, exploding but causing no injuries. 2 bombs planted at Pennsylvania Station, one in a rental locker and the other in a phone booth, both exploded without injury. A telephone call warned of a bomb at Radio City Music Hall, which was discovered before it detonated. At the Roxy Theater, a bomb dropped out of its hiding place inside a slashed seat, landing onto an upholsterer's workbench without exploding. At the Paramount Theater, a seat bomb exploded, with one patron struck on the shoe by fragments, but was no injured. Upon further investigation, police found a penknife pushed inside the seat, one of several found at the scene of theater bombings. Finally, in December 1954, a bomb exploded in a men's room stall at Grand Central Station, with no reported injuries. In April 1956, the New York Police Department issued a multi-state alert for a person who was described as a skilled mechanic over the age of 40, who had access to a drill press or lathe, who posted mail from White Plains, and had a deep-rooted hatred for the Consolidated Edison Company. Police distributed samples of the bomber's distinctive printing and requested anyone who recognized it to contact them immediately. Investigators reviewed all driving license applications in White Plains, the city from where the mad bomber had mailed one of his bombs, and found similarities between 500 of them and the bomber's printing. The names of these individuals were forwarded to the NYPD to investigate as potential suspects. A warning circular featuring a homemade pipe bomb similar to the bomber's was also distributed in the unlikely event that someone might recognize the handiwork. In 1956, a bomb hidden in a toilet bowl exploded at Pennsylvania Station, seriously injuring a 74-year-old men's room attendant. A young man had reported an obstruction, and the attendant had attempted to dislodge it using a plunger. Found among the porcelain fragments was a watch frame and a woolen sock. A piece of pipe about 5 inches long was found at the RCA building in Rockefeller Center by a security guard. A second guard thought it might come in useful with a plumbing project and took it home with him. It later exploded on his kitchen table at his New Jersey home early the next morning. Miraculously, no one was hurt. In what would be the bomber's most lethal attack so far occurred on December 2nd, 1956, at the Paramount Theater in Brooklyn. At 7:55 p.m., a bomb detonated, ripping apart the theater and injuring 6 of the theater's 1,500 occupants, 3 of whom seriously. As the bomber himself would soon write, it was by the hand of God that nobody had been killed. This incident drew tremendous news coverage, not only of the bomber's ability to stay one step ahead, but also of the New York Police Department's inability to catch the madman. The day after the Paramount Theater bombing, Police Commissioner Stephen P. Kennedy met with commanding officers of every NYPD division and ordered what was described as the greatest manhunt in the history of the police department. He called the bomber's actions an outrage that cannot be tolerated and promised an immediate good promotion to whomever arrested the bomber. He directed all police commanders to alert every serving member of the force to the absolute necessity of an arrest. The prevailing theory throughout the investigation was that the bomber was a former Con Edison employee who held a grudge against the company. Although detectives reviewed the company employment records, there were hundreds of other leads, tips, and crack reports to follow up on. Officers checked vocational schools where bomb parts might be manufactured, as well as lawsuit records and mental hospital admissions. Anyone who behaved oddly was turned in by their well-meaning neighbors, and anyone who knew too much about explosives was considered a suspect by coworkers and family members. The NYPD established the Bomb Investigation Unit, which was formed to work nothing but leads in the Mad Bomber case. New York had been effectively paralyzed by the bomber, who was holding hostage the greatest port in the most powerful nation that ever existed, with fear and suspicion. The detectives working the case were determined to stop him before someone was killed, but were fast running out of options and were willing to try anything to catch their quarry. With traditional detective techniques failing to provide leads, Inspector Howard Finney of the New York City Crime Lab decided it was time to try something new. He asked his friend Captain Cronin at the Missing Persons Bureau if he had any ideas, and he suggested that perhaps a psychiatrist could develop a profile of the bomber, which might prove useful in catching him. In 1956, the concept of criminal profiling wasn't exactly new, but it was certainly an experimental concept that had not been used effectively to solve a major case. Cronin recommended Finney talk to a friend of his that had had some minor success in psychiatric detecting. Finney, who was himself a man of science with a master's degree in forensic criminology who ran the crime lab effectively, was also a tough and respected veteran of the force and possessed the knowledge and clout needed to try such a radical idea. Despite remaining skeptical of head shrinking, Finney decided to give the concept a try. In December 1956, accompanied by 2 of his detectives, Finney paid a visit to Cronin's friend. With a bulging case file tucked under his arm, he entered the office of Manhattan criminal psychiatrist named Dr. James Brussel. Little did he know, but Dr. Brussel would prove to be extremely influential in helping the police find the madman that had eluded them for 16 years. Dr. James Brussel. Unbeknown to the NYPD, the pipe-smoking, sharp-witted Dr. James Arnold Brussel had casually considered the Mad Bomber case and had, like most New Yorkers, read about the case in the papers and wondered what kind of person would commit such crimes. As a criminal psychiatrist, he had asked himself many questions about the mystery bomber. Who was he, and what motivated him to act? As he had no access to the case files, the doctor had never came up with any solid conclusions, and he just toyed with several theories to those questions. This would change when Inspector Finney visited his office with the Mad Bomber case file. Dr. Brussel had agreed to meet with the inspector as a favor to his old friend Captain Cronin. Dr. Brussel worked primarily within a private practice, but also served as the Assistant Commissioner of Mental Hygiene for the state of New York. In this position, he was often called in to consult with police forces and attended police conferences, where he both impressed and befriended Captain Cronin. Dr. Brussel later published his memoir, the casebook of a crime psychiatrist, in which he admits he doubted his usefulness in solving Finney's mad bomber case. Despite being confident of his own professional skills and abilities, he believed that he would be unable to add anything that professional detectives hadn't already discovered. These self-doubts would be misplaced. He was more than capable to effectively profiling a criminal such as the Mad Bomber. He had previously served in the military as chief of neuropsychiatry at Fort Dix during World War II, and then as the head of Army neuropsychiatry for the entire Army during the Korean War. During this time, he had also done counterintelligence profiling work for the FBI and the CID. Dr. Brussel would also admit that Finney intimidated him, and believed the inspector wouldn't settle for anything but solid conclusions and would dismiss the psychiatric profession entirely if he was proved wrong. Under a certain amount of pressure to come up with results, Dr. Brussel read through the case file and developed a profile of the culprit. First and foremost, he deduced that the bomber was most certainly insane. What Finney's detectives had considered as scant evidence was in fact a wellspring of information for Dr. Brussel. After poring over the notes in the case files, he came to the following conclusions. The bomber was male, because with a few exceptions, most bombers historically have always been male. He held a grudge against Con Edison and was likely a former employee. He believed himself to have been permanently injured by the company and was seeking his revenge. This conclusion was most obvious from the bomber's own letters. The bomber was a textbook paranoid who believed that Con Edison and even the public at large had conspired against him. He was probably middle-aged, around 50 years old. Dr. Brussels reached this conclusion by the fact that paranoia peaks around the age of 35, and the bomber had been active for some 16 years. He was neat, skilled, and meticulous in his work, and everything from the careful workmanship of the bombs, to the neat lettering, to the careful planting of the bombs was an indication of his patience and neatness. The doctor explained that paranoids tend to set themselves very high standards so as not to open themselves up to unwanted criticism. The bomber, he said, was overly sensitive to criticism, which is a classic symptom of paranoia. The bomber was foreign, or spent the majority of his time with foreign people. This was deduced from his stilted writing, which was full of formal language bereft of any contemporary slang. He preferred phrases like dastardly deeds that sounded outdated, as if from Victorian fiction. He referred to Con Edison as the Con Edison, when New Yorkers had referred to the utility giant without the article "the" for years. He would have had at least a high school education, but probably not college. While the excellent handwriting indicated at least some formal schooling, it appeared more likely he would be mostly self-educated, as evident from the stilted language of the letters and skilled construction of the bombs. The bomber was a Slav, and probably Roman Catholic. This conclusion was reached because, culturally speaking, Eastern and Central Europeans most often employ bombs as weapons, and most Slavs are of the Catholic faith. He lived in Connecticut, not New York. As some of the letters had been mailed from Westchester County, a location in between Connecticut and New York, and Connecticut was then home to large communities of Eastern and Central Europeans. The bomber suffered from an Oedipal complex, loving his mother while hating his father and other authority figures. Like most Oedipal sufferers, he was likely unmarried and lived with a single female relative or relatives that were not his mother. It was likely he was young when he lost his mother. This correlation with sex was reached by Dr. Brussels through conclusions based on the strange and breast-like W's in the bomber's otherwise perfect handwriting, the phallic construction of the bombs, and the strange slashing and penetration of the movie theater's seats. These were considered by Finney and his detectives to be Dr. Brussels' most far-fetched and dubious conclusions, but he remained confident in them. Despite their reservations and doubts, Finney and his detectives were impressed. Through traditional detecting, they had drawn some of Dr. Brussels' conclusions themselves, and none of the points raised in the profile contradicted any of their own beliefs about the bomber. As Dr. Brussel developed his profile, he became more and more confident in the validity of his conclusions. A confidence that was soon shared by the NYPD's finest. Once they had the profile, Finney asked Dr. Brussel what they should do with it. Although it was specific in the many deductions, there were potentially hundreds of men who fit it and only one bomber they were hunting. Dr. Brussel made a suggestion. I think you ought to publicize the description I've given you. Publicize the whole bomber investigation, in fact. Spread it in the newspapers, on radio and television. Finney was surprised, not least because it was standard procedure to keep details of the case out of the papers. I think there's a chance he'll come forward by himself if we handle him right. I think he wants to be found out, said Dr. Brussel. He continued to argue with the detectives that it was publicity the bomber craved, and he wanted acknowledgement and credit for his work. The newspapers not publishing his letters had outraged him, and he would be further outraged at the idea of some pseudo-psychiatrist trying to work out his identity. Dr. Brussel made a prediction. He said that if, in fact, anything was wrong about the bomber in the profile, he wouldn't be able to resist telling the police and media about the error. Even if the profile turned out to be exact, the bomber might be tempted into revealing details that could lead the police to him. Ultimately, Dr. Brussel won the argument, and despite the fact that Finney believed that they would have to deal with a million crackpots making false reports, in addition to the real bomber, he agreed to Dr. Brussel's plan. As Finney and his detectives were about to leave the office, Dr. Brussel made one more conclusion about their suspect. He suspected that such a neat, conservative man would be wearing the safest and most conservative clothes of the day in the neatest possible way. "One more thing," said Dr. Brussel with his eyes closed for dramatic effect. "When you catch him, and I have no doubt you will, he'll be wearing a double-breasted suit." After a shocked exclamation from one of the detectives, Dr. Brussel continued, "And it will be buttoned." With the game now afoot, the newspapers were preparing to release the details of Dr. Brussel's profile on Christmas Day. On Christmas Eve, a clerk at the New York Public Library was using a phone booth when he dropped a coin. As he bent down to retrieve it, he saw a maroon-colored sock held to the underside of the shelf by a magnet. The sock was found to contain an iron pipe with a threaded cap on each end. After consulting with other employees, the clerk threw the device out of a window and into Bryant Park. The bomb squad promptly arrived on the scene, accompanied by more than 60 NYPD officers and detectives. An unexploded bomb removed by New York's bomb squad. On Christmas Day, all the major New York newspapers, including the New York Times, published summaries of Dr. Brussel's profile. Just as Finney had predicted, the cranks and crackpots responded in force. Many of them wanted to take credit for the bomber's actions, but none of them could recreate or produce FP's singularly well-crafted bombs. Investigators had deliberately kept photographs and details about the devices out of the papers, not wishing anyone to replicate the explosives. At the peak of this hysteria on December 28th, the NYPD received over 50 false bomb alarms and another 20 by the next day. Another bomb found in late December, inside a seat at the Times Square Paramount. This one was considered the Mad Bomber's 33rd bomb, which did not explode or cause any injuries. As well as the negative responses, plenty of normal and helpful-minded citizens offered leads to the police. Most had a friend or neighbor who fit the profile and were convinced they had discovered the bomber's identity. This was one of the pitfalls of criminal profiling, in that inevitably many innocent people can be suspected of crimes simply because they fit the profile. Among this flurry of false leads was a Darien, Connecticut, commuter who told the police about a neighbor who had once worked for Con Edison and had spent some time in mental hospitals for paranoia. He was a skilled mechanic and was married to a woman 10 years older than himself. The marriage didn't fit the profile, but Dr. Brussel thought the older wife might be a deviation of the Oedipal theory. The man frequently traveled to New York City and was seen carrying a mysterious blue valise. His neighbor had been most curious about the valise for many years, and after he saw the profile that was published, he called the police. Detectives discreetly questioned the man with the valise, and they discovered the contents to be a pair of women's high-heeled boots. The man had a foot fetish, and he would frequent prostitutes in the city who donned the boots for him. An elderly man residing on the Upper West Side who telephoned the police about a Polish neighbor who lived with an aunt and often tinkered with metal in his spare time. He said the man often left the house at odd hours and carried with him strange-shaped packages. The man was interviewed by police who discovered that he was an aspiring modern sculptor who sold his works on the streets of Greenwich Village. Another man reported an eccentric army buddy who fed stray cats as a hobby. The man had been an army demolitions expert and, interestingly, had once worked for Con Edison. After following the man for a few days, the police determined that the man simply liked to feed cats and nothing more. Even Dr. Brussel himself would follow up on a false lead. A colleague told him, within the confines of doctor-patient privilege, of a regular patient with an irrational grudge against Con Edison. Excitedly, Dr. Brussel examined the file and found the man did indeed fit the profile. Unfortunately, this man had been confined to a mental hospital on the day of one of the bomber's attacks. During this time, the bomber stepped up his attacks by planting his 33rd bomb and wrote more letters. He also managed to call Dr. Brussel directly, a feat considered both clever and threatening since the doctor's number was unlisted. The conversation went as follows. Dr. Brussels. Hello? Mad Bomber. Is this Dr. Brussel, the psychiatrist? Dr. Brussels. Yes, this is Dr. Brussel. Mad Bomber. This is FP speaking. Keep out of this or you'll be sorry. The bomber hung up before the call could be traced. Privately, Dr. Brussel was pleased by this, as he felt it was only a matter of time before the bomber would slip up and his arrogance got the better of him. The day after the profile had been published, the New York Journal-American published an open letter, prepared in cooperation with investigators, which urged the bomber to surrender. The newspaper promised a fair trial and offered to publish his grievances against Con Edison. The bomber wrote back the next day, signing the letter FP. He said he would not give himself up and revealed his desire to bring the Con Edison to justice. He went on to list all the locations where bombs had been placed and showed some concern that not all had been discovered. This would prove to be the case, with one bomb still unaccounted for. He also wrote later in the letter, "My days on Earth are numbered. Most of my adult life has been spent in bed. My one consolation is that I can strike back, even from my grave, for the dastardly acts against me." The newspaper published an edited version of the bomber's letter on January 10, 1957, along with another letter asking him to provide more information about his grievances. A second letter from the bomber provided more details about his bomb making. He said he favored using pistol powder because shotgun powder has very little power, and went on to promise a bombing truce until at least March 1st. Concerning his grievance, he wrote, "I was injured on job at Consolidated Edison plant. As a result, I am adjudged, totally and permanently disabled." He went on to say he had to cover his own medical bills and that Consolidated Edison had blocked his workers' compensation case. He added, "When a motorist injures a dog, he must report it. Not so with an injured workman. He rates less than a dog. I tried to get my story to the press. I tried hundreds of others. I typed tens of thousands of words, about 800,000. Nobody cared. I determined to make these dastardly acts known. I have plenty of time to think. I decide on bombs." He said that the public library bomb, as well as the one found later that same week at the Times Square Paramount, had been planted months before. This letter was again edited by police and published on January 15th, and the newspaper again asked for more details and dates about his compensation case, so they claimed a new and fair hearing could be held. Detectives hoped he would reveal enough information for them to identify him. The third letter was received on 4 days later, and the bomber complained of lying unnoticed for hours on cold concrete after his injury without receiving any first aid. He said he developed pneumonia and later tuberculosis. As requested, the author included more information about his lost compensation case and the perjury of his co-workers. He gave the date of his accident as September 5, 1931. The letter suggested that if he did not have a family that would be unfairly treated by him giving himself up, he might consider doing so to get his compensation claim reopened. The bomber thanked for Journal-American for publicizing his case and announced, "The bombings will never be resumed." Meanwhile, Con Edison tasked several of its administrative staff members with going through the vast list of what they termed troublesome employee files, searching for anyone who fit the profile. This was no easy job and involved a complex process because of the history of the company. As the name suggests, Con Edison had been created by the merging of several smaller utility companies in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The post-merger records had been well kept and orderly, but the pre-merger records were an incomplete hodgepodge of various different filing methods. According to Dr. Brussel's profile, The suspected middle-aged bomber could well have been an employee of one of the smaller companies, making his identification a headache. A clerk by the name of Alice Kelly had spent several days scouring through stacks of files of worker compensation cases before she came upon the file of George Metesky of Waterbury, Connecticut. Metesky had previously worked for United Electric and Power Company. At first glance, he seemed to fit the profile, so Kelly took a closer look. Metesky had suffered an on-site accident at the plant where he worked that occurred on September 5, 1931. He blamed his subsequent tuberculosis on that accident, a claim that could not be proven. After his disability claim was denied, Metesky had written several angry letters to the company, one citing the injustice of his case, his permanent disability, and promising revenge for the firm's dastardly deeds. These were words that had been used by the bomber in his letters to the Journal American. She excitedly brought the file to her superior and said, "I think maybe," as she handed over the file. When the bomber had given more details about his accident, he made the kind of arrogant slip-up that Dr. Brussel had predicted he would. He had naturally assumed the records of his accident, and claims were long lost in the files of the utility giant that he so despised. He could not have known that Alice Kelly had found his file, or that the police would soon discover the places and dates recorded in the Metesky file matched the ones he'd given to the newspaper. Shortly before 5 p.m. on the evening that same day, investigators were notified of the development and initially treated it as just one of a number of leads they were working on. They asked Waterbury police to do a discreet check on George Metesky at his house. The dapper, Slavic man who lived at number 17 4th Street in Waterbury, Connecticut, with his two unmarried sisters, didn't appear to work for a living. His neighbors didn't know what to make of him, and he was always polite but distant. Hardly anyone in the neighborhood knew anything about him. His house was called the Crazy House by local children who feared Metesky, but it is unknown why it earned this name, as there was never any evidence of madness of crazy antics at the house. He would take frequent excursions to New York City, something which made some of his neighbors curious. Others wondered what he was tinkering with in his workshop at all hours of the day and night. Around the same time as local newspapers began to publicize Dr. Brussel's profile of the mad bomber, Metesky's neighbors noticed a change in him. He seemed friendlier, even talkative at times, something he had never been previously. It was reported he helped a local boy fix his model airplane, and the neighborhood children were no longer afraid of him. Residents in the neighborhood commented to one another that they might have misjudged the eccentric Metesky. The connection between Metesky and Con Idson might have been made sooner, had they known had once worked for the utility company. It might have raised their suspicions when the police stopped by number 17 on a routine house-to-house check regarding an automobile accident and did not stop at any other houses. Several nights later, on January 21, 1957, the neighbors were shocked when the police came and arrested Metesky. Shortly before midnight, Waterbury police, accompanied by 4 NYPD detectives, arrived at Metesky's home with a search warrant. Dressed in his bathrobe, they asked him for a handwriting sample, and he was told to write the letter G. He did so, and then looked up and said, "I know why you fellows are here. You think I'm the mad bomber." He then pleasantly and politely confessed to being the bomber. He revealed that FP stood for fair play. He led them to his workshop where they found his lathe he used for constructing the bombs. At the back of house, they found pipes and various materials for bomb making hidden in the pantry, along with flashlight batteries, cheap pocket watches, brass terminal knobs, and unmatched woolen socks of the type used to transport the devices. Unfinished bombs and bomb-making materials found in Metesky's workshop. At the station, Metesky told the detectives he had been gassed in the Con Edison accident and went into detail about what transpired that day in September 1931. He had been working as a generator wiper at the company's Hellgate generating plant when a boiler backfire produced a blast of hot gases. The blast knocked Metesky off his feet, and he choked as the fumes filled his lungs. He said the accident left him disabled, and, after collecting 26 weeks of sick pay, he lost his job. According to claims disputed by Consolidated Edison, the accident led to pneumonia, which eventually turned into tuberculosis. His claim for workers' compensation was denied because he apparently took too long to file it, and his 3 subsequent appeals were all rejected. His hatred for the company developed from this incident and his treatment after the accident. He held particular disdain for the company lawyers and for three co-workers whose testimony during his compensation case he said was perjured in favor of the company. Presented with a list of 32 bomb locations but never once using the word bomb, Metesky was able to recall the exact date where each unit had been placed as well as its size. He even added to the police list the date, size, and location of 15 early devices which investigators had not previously been aware of, that he had placed at Con Edison locations that were never reported. He explained when these Con Edison bombs were not reported in the newspapers, he began planting them in public places to garner publicity for what he described as the injustices committed against him. He also confirmed the reason he never planted any bombs during the United States' involvement in World War II was born out of patriotic reasons. During their search of his workshop, police found material and bomb parts for a device that was larger than anything he had made before. Metesky explained that he intended to plant it at the New York Coliseum. Some 8 months after his arrest, in September 1957, police were able to locate a third bomb planted at Lowe's Theater on Lexington Avenue that was previously overlooked. After thorough searches, detectives were confident that 2 other devices that remained unaccounted for were no longer there, despite Metesky's insistence they had been planted. Following Metesky's arrest, there was some confusion from early police statements about who was credited with finding his file. And NYPD detectives had been erroneously given praise for this, and only later was it found during a reward investigation that Alice Kelly had found the file. This misplaced credit was explained as due to a misunderstanding of the file being picked up by the detective, as meaning it was plucked out of a stack of files. Although the NYPD did credit Kelly with handing in the clue that led to his arrest, she declined to accept the $25,000 reward, claiming that she had merely been doing her job. The board of directors at Consolidated Edison also declined to file for the reward. However, a group of shareholders did file, claiming to be representatives of Alice Kelly and the company. A police investigation eventually found that Con Edison had impeded the investigation into Metesky by telling detectives that the employee records whose services were terminated prior to 1940, the same group which Metesky belonged, had been destroyed. It was only through a confidential tip that this was discovered to be untrue. Con Edison also stalled police demands and formal requests for the paperwork, stating they were legal documents and the company's legal department would need to be consulted before they gained access. The president of Con Edison later issued a statement describing these claims as due to a misunderstanding. Metesky admitted planting 32 bombs, and before a grand jury, some 35 witnesses gave testimony. Among those who gave evidence were police experts and those injured by the Mad Bomber's explosives. He was indicted on 47 charges, including attempted murder, maliciously endangering life, damaging a building by use of explosive devices, and violation of New York State's Sullivan Law, which prohibited the carrying on concealed weapons. He faced 7 counts of attempted murder, with only those of 7 victims who had been injured during the preceding 5 years. Metesky had been sent to Manhattan's Bellevue Hospital, where he had been undergoing psychiatric examination and was brought before the courtroom to hear the charges. After hearing testimony from psychiatric experts, Judge Samuel Leibowitz declared George Metesky to be a paranoid schizophrenic. He deemed him hopeless and incurable both mentally and physically, and found him legally insane and incompetent to stand trial. On April 18, 1957, the judge had Metesky committed to the Mattawan Hospital for the criminally insane at Beacon, New York. Expected to live only a few weeks because he was in the advanced stages of tuberculosis, Metesky had to be carried into the hospital. His health improved after a year and a half of treatment, and according to a newspaper article written 14 years later, the 68-year-old Metesky was described as vigorous and healthy-looking. During his time at the asylum, Metesky was, like most acute paranoids, unresponsive to treatment. He firmly believed the psychiatrists were part of the conspiracy against him. Despite this, he proved to be a model patient and spent much of his time trying to legally win his release. The Journal-American, true to their word, hired a leading workers' compensation attorney, Bartholomew James O'Burke, to appeal his disallowed claim for his 1931 injury, on the grounds that Metesky was mentally incompetent at the time and did not understand his rights. This appeal, like his previous attempts, was denied. The Metesky case would prove to be the feather in Inspector Finney's cap, and he continued his stellar career, later becoming a well-known corruption buster. The case also benefited the career of Dr. Brussel, who rose to fame based on his criminal profile, and he was often called in as a consultant on the nation's most high-profile unsolved cases. With varying levels of success, he worked on the Coppolino poisoning case, the Sunday bomber of 1960, the 1980 Wiley murders, and most notably the case of the Boston Strangler. The way police forces catch criminals was forever changed by his work, and to the present day, criminal profiling is now an integral part of modern police methods. Metesky had fitted Brussel's profile in every detail. The doctor often worked at Mattawan Asylum and visited Metesky occasionally. He always found his charming and talkative. Metesky often pointed out that he'd purposefully constructed his bombs not to kill anyone. Dr. Brussel once asked him directly if he thought he was crazy, and Metesky smiled politely and answered no. In 1973, the United States Supreme Court ruled that a mentally ill defendant cannot be committed to a hospital operated by the New York State Department of Correctional Services, unless a jury finds them dangerous. Because George Metesky had been admitted to Mattawan without a jury trial, he was transferred to the Creedmoor Psychiatric Center, which was a state hospital situated outside the correctional system. Their doctors determined he was harmless, and as he had already served 2/3 of his 25-year sentence, the maximum he would have received at trial, he was released on December 13, 1972. His release was allowed on the condition that he make regular visits to a Connecticut Department of Mental Hygiene clinic that was near his family home. Upon his release, Metesky was interviewed by a reporter and said that he had given up any desire to commit further violence, but reaffirmed his anger and resentment towards Consolidated Edison. He also said that before he began planting his bombs, I wrote 900 letters to the mayor, to the police commissioner, to the newspapers, and I never even got a penny postcard back. Then I went to the newspapers to try to buy advertising space, but all of them turned me down. I was compelled to bring my story to the public. He took up residence at his family's Waterbury residence, where he died some 20 years later in 1994 at the age of 90. His death was not reported in the papers. The bombing campaign waged by Metesky, as well as his letters to the authorities, would inspire new criminals. He had gripped New York City in a blind panic and held the people hostage with his acts of terrorism for over a decade. Investigators believe that both the Unabomber and the Zodiac Killer took inspiration from New York City's Mad Bomber when committing their own crimes.